Magic the Gathering is full of counterspells. In fact, there are 273 cards that have the words counter target spell on them. From classic counterspell to absolutely broken free counterspells to counterspells with set mechanics, there are many ways to stop your opponents in their tracks. Today I wanted to look at some of the worst counterspells in Magic and look at where they can be played, if anywhere. Now I am going to avoid talking about hyper-specific counterspells and instead focus on just weird ones that have unusual effects. So let's get into it. Fold into Aether. Fold into Aether is a counterspell that's so weird, so bad, and so obscure that it's not even played in Commander, with only 109 decks on EDHREC. And it's not too difficult to understand why. It costs a whopping 4 mana, and the spell's controller gets to put a creature from their hand onto the battlefield? So what this card really ends up saying is counter your own spell to cheat something big into play. So you might play this in a commander deck that runs a lot of large creatures and tiny spells. Counter your Opt to drop a Hullbreaker Horror or a Blightsteel Colossus on your opponent's end step. You could also play it in a group hug deck if you want your opponent to put something into play. Regardless, it's irredeemably bad in 99.99% of situations, and that's why it's the first one I wanted to mention here. Hisoka Minamo Sensei. Hisoka Minamo Sensei is a creature with an ability to counter spells. Sounds pretty good, right? Repeatable counterspell? Well, let's see. He's a 4 mana 1/3, and you can pay 3 mana and discard a card to counter a spell with the same mana value as the discarded card. Okay, this card definitely qualifies as a bad counterspell even though it's repeatable, but I personally run it as a commander because it's dumb and funny and I wanted a dumb commander. Now you obviously want this to be a deck that draws a lot of cards and a deck that cares about discarding cards, which is why my commander deck has a lot of madness effects and has Atemsis All-Seeing as a win condition. Which, fun little side story here, I was testing my Hisoka Minamo Sensei deck 1v1 against my friend recently, and I was able to do something pretty absurd. I was able to ult Tamiyo the Moon Sage and get her emblem, and then I cast High Tide, effectively infinite times, enough to make thousands of mana. Then I cycled Lonely Sandbar over and over until I drew both Atemsis and Lightning Greaves. Then I played both and I attacked in to win the game, since most of my library was in my hand, so I had all the different mana costs needed. This is definitely magical Christmas land, but it did happen and it was a lot of fun. So anyways, back to Hisoka. He is a mind game because if you leave 3 mana up, your opponent will attempt to play around the counter. Notably though, discarding a card is part of the cost, and it only counters the spell if the mana value matches. So you can use this as a discard outlet if you absolutely need to, as long as a spell is on the stack, even if the mana value doesn't match. And Hisoka doesn't have to tap to activate this ability, so theoretically you could counter multiple spells in a turn cycle. Now I'm not going to pretend that this card is good, but it certainly is interesting, unique, and in some very specific situations, not the worst card to ever exist. Counterlash. Counterlash is one of those cards that looks like it would go crazy in Commander, but the truth is it's just bad. It is a 6 mana counterspell, which is far too much mana to hold up for a counter even in a blue deck. The upside though is that you can cast a card that shares a card type with the countered spell. So you have to hold up 6 mana, you have to have a variety of card types so you can actually cast a free spell, and it has to cost at least 4 mana, otherwise you're better off just playing counterspell and then casting the other spell for its cost. Sure, if this ever goes off properly, it could be really cool, but mostly it will do nothing. If you do want to play it, the best commanders for it are Emoti, where it will trigger Cascade, or a cost reduction commander like a Luge. A card like Counterlash looks even worse when you consider the fact that there are 4 mana counterspells that exist today that let you cast a spell for free from your hand. Dispersal Shield. Talk about conditions. Dispersal Shield can counter a spell for only 2 mana, but only if its mana value is less than or equal to the highest mana value among permanents you control. This, of course, being in the color least likely to be playing permanents, mind you. That said, it has some redeeming qualities in a commander deck that is likely to have big creatures. It sees some play in ninjutsu or other cheaty decks, as well as naturally expensive commanders like the Pride of Holclade and Eris Roar of the Storm. Equinox. Equinox is our honorary white counterspell for the video, and it's the only one I'm going to include for the sole reason of it being super specific, just because it's too ridiculous not to mention. Some counterspells can only counter something that targets a permanent you control, or if it's the second spell cast this turn, or something like that. But Equinox is a land enchantment that lets you tap the land to counter a spell that would destroy one or more lands you control. This is a pretty niche ability, especially since land destruction is generally frowned upon in Commander. Plus, I feel like strip mine effects are a lot more common than actual spells that destroy lands, and this can't counter abilities. This card sees a reasonable amount of play in exactly one commander, which is Noyandar Royal Shaper. This is the only commander that includes white that cares about animating lands into creatures, and it turns this enchantment into a way to protect the lands that you're animating. It's also fine to include in Preston Garvey or Estrid the Mass, just to get a 1-mana aura that is unlikely to get removed. Fervent Denial. Fervent Denial is exactly what you should be doing when you see this card and are tempted to put it into a deck. Spells with flashback are sometimes costed higher than what they would normally be, in order to offset the fact that you can cast the spell twice. But getting to cast Counterspell twice is hardly worth it when they cost an average of 6 mana each time. Fervent Denial is unredeemably awful. Even if you're looking for more flashback cards or more counterspells, surely there's a better card you could play than this. Despite that, a handful of deck lists do actually run this in commanders that care about flashback or casting spells from other zones, mostly in Savine the Chronoclasm, for which I believe this card was in the pre-constructed deck for. Mind Static. There are some 4-mana counterspells out there that are cancel plus an additional effect, but what if your 4-mana counterspell didn't even counter the spell? Then you'd have Mind Static, which somehow costs 4 mana and still isn't a hard counter. 6 mana is a major tax to pay, but if an opponent wants to pay for attacks like this, they will. Giving them options, no matter how bad, is almost always a bad choice, because they will choose the option that is best for them. And sure, 6 is a high number, but why not just play a hard counter that costs 3 mana, huh? The only vaguely redeemable place for this spell is in Melik Reforged Researcher, where it will likely only cost 1 mana, but it's still really bad. It's so bad, while still being technically playable, that it's actually included in my Bad Cards Cube, which is a cube full of awful cards that still offer a playable experience. I guess it shouldn't be surprising that this card is so bad given what set it's from. Sunken Field. Sunken Field is one of those counterspell effects that make you say, wait, is this maybe not terrible? But then you realize that it is, in fact, quite terrible. It is another land enchantment that lets you tap the enchanted land to counter a spell unless its controller pays 1. Basically, you're forcing your opponent to always spend 1 less mana than they have available in order to play around this. Sounds not bad when you put it that way, but since you have to leave the enchanted land up to activate it, you're also using 1 less mana than you have available. Now granted, that's less bad, since you're probably the blue tempo deck, but still. It's also worse than a 1-mana tax on every spell, and there's plenty of cards like that you can play. This is definitely better in 1v1, like in some weird cube, but in a 4-player commander game, the land of weird cards, this is still pretty bad. You will maybe get the opportunity to counter 1 spell in a turn cycle, but even then it's easy to play around. What's really funny is that it sees play in a pretty niche Lord of the Rings commander, Sharky Tyrant of the Shire. You enchant an opponent's land, they can't activate the ability, and Sharky gets the countering ability. It's not too difficult to untap creatures in blue, so it's not the worst there, but it's definitely a corner case. I've never seen this commander before, and my god does this deck seem goofy. So those are a few of the funniest and worst counterspells that I could find. If you play any of these obscure cards, let me know in the comments below, and if any of these cards was new to you, how about you give the video a like. This has been Masonzero MTG, and I will see you in the next video.